Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us for this episode of DevRelish, where we have Matt Stratton as our special guest. Of course, I am Brian Rinaldi. I'm a developer experience engineer at Launch Darkly, and my co-host is...
Hi, I'm Erin. I am currently looking for my next adventure in DevRel, Dev Advocacy, Dev Experience. Maybe a very online human that works with developers. The titles get more interesting by day. And we're here with Matt Stratton.
Yeah.
Hi.
Tell us a little bit about yourself, Matty. Where do you work? What you do?
Cool. Yes. So my name is Matty. I am the director of DevRel for a company called Aiven. We are the trusted open source data platform for everyone. And I have been kind of working in the DevRel industry officially for like 5 years. That sounds about right. Unofficially, a little longer than that. Been working in tech for a couple, 2, 3, 30, whatever years, maybe not 30, but I always used to tell people when I would talk to folks who didn't know about DevRel or advocacy, whatever we do, talk to regular folks out there, and they're like, "What do you do?" I said, "I worked in tech ops for a couple decades, and now they pay me to talk about it." So, very involved in the DevOps community, DevOps Days stuff, a bunch of junk we'll just talk about at some point. But
that sounds similar to the answer I give to people about DevRel, because it's really hard to explain. The other one I say is like, DevRel, it's marketing for developers who think they hate marketing.
Yes. I was going to say the other way I say it is the way that's going to make a lot of DevRel people angry, but that's okay, is I say it's guerrilla marketing.
Yeah.
Indirect marketing is the nicer way to say that.
Yeah,
but that's part of what DevRel can do, right?
Yeah, I was going to say that both sounds better than what I tell, because my parents ask me what I do, and they've only come on their whole conception of what I do is talk on the internet with strangers who are also nerds. And I'm like,
that's not wrong.
Yeah, I was like, Mom, not wrong. But
show me the lie.
Yeah, I'm like, not wrong, but also, we're gonna lean into it.
Yeah. So yeah, actually my spicy take on that whole marketing for developers who say they hate marketing is I always say, because they say they hate marketing, because even though that same developer who's like, yeah, if it's marketing, I don't pay attention. And then they'll walk away with their laptop covered in stickers and their t-shirt with the logo on it. I'm like, yeah, you do hate marketing.
I think I'm actually wearing a pair of Launch Darkly socks right now. So,
They are really nice socks.
They are very, I will say the one company that has to be is Oracle.
Oracle socks, but they have Oracle's logo on them though.
They do. I know that's the downside, but their stance, I'm sorry, sold out to the brands. So, but
okay.
DevRel for DevOps. I think when I first got into the DevRel, technical developer advocacy space, DevOps was that intimidating area for me, to be totally transparent. And I got kind of a crash course working in machine learning where it's very ops heavy and you have a lot of databases or the backend stuff. But how might DevRel, Matty, differ for DevOps than it does kind of many of our other types of organization? Or a better question, does it?
Well, it does. And we've talked about this in a couple different ways, and we can have there could be a whole podcast talking about what DevOps means, and maybe it's been running for 10 years and it's called Arrested DevOps, and you should listen to it. But when we think about sometimes we talk about it as OpsRel, and it's that sort of DevOps is a kind of a subset of this conversation. And when I think about the type of DevRel that I've done, it's always been in that space a little bit. I do not primarily function well as a software engineer. And one of the general problems we have, and we just all have to make our peace with it, is the word we mean half of the time is practitioner. And we've all shortcutted that to developer, unless you're at Amazon and then it's builder, which just confuses everything else. But when we say developer, most of the time in our type of part of the world of industry, we're generally speaking about practitioner, likely technical practitioner. So anyway, that said, let's look at where Matty came from, right? So my sideway entry into DevRel was doing sales engineering and customer architect type roles that had a lot of community focus when I was working at Chef, which was a configuration management, infrastructure as code, whatever kind of thing, where very DevOpsy, but also still like my peeps over there were ops folks. They were SREs, or even before SREs, they were, ops, right? We were infrastructure people, right? Who were learning how to do some developer things, or maybe not, or wherever that comes in. And yes, we can talk about like, yeah, chefs for everybody, blah, blah, blah. And then I went and then I was at PagerDuty. And that was my first, like, now my title is advocate. And actually my title over there was DevOps advocate, which was really funny because I'm like, I advocate for DevOps. I do that all the time. But it really was like what we would lump into like a developer relations role. But the average consumer, like the people that we were advocating to, were not software engineer title folks. Some of them were, but a lot of it was still like the people having these conversations with tended to be infrastructure, operations, SRE, whatever. And then the same thing. I've worked at Pulumi. I've worked a bunch of different, with another infracode. But I think where it comes to be interesting is depending on your product, because sometimes if it's and when I say a developer oriented product, I don't mean a product that developers use, but it's a thing you use directly to make your thing, right? Like if your product is an API that you embed into your code, or it's a library or whatever, that's a certain kind of product, and you DevRel that in a certain way. If it's a service or a thing that developers use, you kind of think about the world in a whole different way, and the DevOps stuff falls into that, right? Think about how if you are, like your product is fundamentally ends up being a library that you embed in your code versus your GitHub, right? Like the whole way you reason about whether people are using you and how you're using it, right? Like it's not how many times was my library downloaded or how many API calls have happened. It's how, we're reasoning about the whole way of success in a different way, and how we show value in a different way. And is it about how we work or what we build? And I think that's another way to think about it. A lot of times, DevRel for DevOps, if you will, is about how you work versus how you build, right? Like, yes, you could make the argument and say, like, if you're like Caslin Fields or someone who's over at Google that's a DevRel for Kubernetes, like maybe that is what you build a little bit. It's not so much how you work. But it's also, you can say it's how you are everything. These lines are fuzzy. We'll just deal with that, right? So the reason that matters is because how you think about your community and giving them the things that they need differs, right? Like, because if you're saying like, cool, I'm going to show you how to like add this library into your code to build another thing, is different than you now have to reason about the world in a whole different way. And I've been places where the point of the advocacy, of the awareness of the community, is getting people to think in a different way, because you have to think in this other way to even see the value of the product, right? Like you're not going to dig Pulumi if you don't think about infracode as being important yet, right? Versus like, I already know the problem I have. I already know I need to do this thing, and so I'm going to use Mailgun because I already know I need to send emails, right? You don't have to convince me that sending email is a thing I have to do. But if I'm reasoning about a different way to do instant response, I want to. So you think in a different idea focus, right? So that's the first thing, is to break down and saying what's the reason someone uses your stuff? Is it for what they do or how they do it? Yeah, how they work, or what their thing they create is. And that goes back, and that's not even about like how you do conference talks. That's even about the things you create to help them be more successful, right? It's like, is it that I'm creating content, if that's the way we say it, or I'm putting things in place for you so that you know how to like respond to incidents better, or how to organize your work better? Or is it, this is how I take this thing and write the code this way and make these pieces go together? Like it's different levels of that. And you have more of the how than the what when you think about quote unquote DevOps or ops rel, right?
Yeah.
So we don't build things, we use things.
That makes total sense, because I was thinking about that as you were talking. I was thinking about, at Launch Darkly, that we kind of sit somewhere in between, because half my job is telling you how to actually take the SDKs and like, okay, how do I use this in this particular project, which is how we do things. But then the other half is like the whole point of that is how do we build, like how we work. So I'm like telling you, okay, here's how you get away from like branching and et cetera, right? Like, so it's a more theoretical how we work kind of thing. So I think your distinction makes sense, and I think, but there are cases like mine where some of that blends together. It's not like a clear cut line.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. I mean, there are places where it cuts in a lot, like everything. What's our favorite thing to say in this entire industry? It depends.
It's
right. And we've said too, it's like
say all the time. Like that's but I think it reminds me of, I'm currently in the interview process talking to a couple companies, and the example that I always give is, because some people I ask companies like, why do you want DevRel, or why is DevRel something that you're choosing to invest in right now with this role? Like, you're hiring an open position. Why do you want DevRel? Reasons. Yeah. And it's like, that's like, I get some, like, sometimes it's like reasons or popularity, or like, we're trying to grow our developer relations. And I'm like, but the one thing that I always get is, and I said it in an interview, and I was like, wow, I don't know if that was like the right question to answer in an interview, but it's also how I feel is, I use Pepto-Bismol as my great example for people who don't want developer relations. It's like, what happens if you build a community like of people who, like, if Pepto-Bismol had a community strategy, what would that look like? No one would want to join. You don't want to be like if you're using the product Pepto-Bismol, I likely don't want to talk to you. Like, that's not a tool. That's not a viable. If I'm having to use that, I'm not going to go want to hang out on the internet with other people using Pepto-Bismol.
No.
Sometimes, but like, I think PagerDuty is a really good example that's contrary to that, which is, I always sort of would laugh about this when people, complain on Twitter about PagerDuty and then we used to remember there was like a sales rep for Opsgenie who would like go and try to reply to them and be like, well, you should try Opsgenie. And they would totally get flamed, because the reason people were complaining about PagerDuty wasn't the product itself. They were complaining about the thing that made them have to use it, right? Like, that's never going to get any better, but they really like the product. It's like, PagerDuty example, it's the product that everybody loves to hate because you hate that it exists. So not to pick apart your analogy, but like it's a thing, but like, you do have this problem, and maybe the product is so good that it's the best that it could be in its shitty situation, as you said in the chat there, Erin.
Are you giving me crap for being in the Pepto community? This is all about my Pepto community.
Yeah.
Are you the one person who like scanned the QR code on the back of the Pepto-Bismol ball? And they're like, oh my god,
there's someone hit
that UTM.
I feel like the person in the one community person at Pepto is like, wow, this Erin person needs to shut up.
I have value.
I'm like, there's my brain
like,
to go on a terrible tangent. Program. Like, what's the UGC strategy for this?
So speaking about, okay, I'm gonna go ahead and bring it up, since you brought about like why companies add DevRel.
Oh,
we had.
Can I ask this one thing? There was a follow-up thing to that Erin said, the question that she asked, she says, why? And I would make an even more refined way of asking that question.
Ooh, I love
is
that.
You would say what is the business value of developer relations in this company? And if they give you anything fuzzy that is not an actual business goal, run away, because you will eventually have a business goal, because awareness is not anybody's goal. That is not a real business goal. It is important, and it does a thing. And I've said before, if you cannot show the business value of what you do, a way of showing value will be assigned to you, and you probably won't like it. So if you can't get a real good answer, like if it's all hand waved, then it's probably a very dangerous place to be, because maybe that'll be true for a while, but at a certain point, your chickens are going to come home to roost on that. And if you don't know, if you're not in front of it, that's how you end up getting burned. That all of a sudden they're like, oh shit, we actually looked at this and we don't know what Erin does here that provides us value. So what's a thing we know? We know MAU. Now guess what you're tied to? Whereas if you start with a business goal, you know what I mean? And it can be an indirect connection to that business goal. It doesn't mean it has to be a thing. But they're like, how does this connect to the bit? And if it's really vague, you are in for a bad time eventually. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not a week from now, but it will happen. And I think a lot of us have seen that happen.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
I
Absolutely.
think that's a really good point. And I think the other thing is the other thing I've learned through just career stuff, and my first job in community was open source community by way of product management. And it's like, so I came from very much a product manager head of thinking of like, where are users dropping off? Where are users, like, where are the pain points in the adoption process? And that is a very different problem than how many paying users do we have. Like, pain points and adoption is different than conversion.
And they're both business goals.
But they're both business goals.
Yeah, they're totally legit, right? That's what I'm saying. Business goal does not necessarily mean revenue. It doesn't necessarily mean paying user or whatever, but so.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think you can ultimately, it is revenue, right? Like ultimately it's revenue. Obviously, like, and that's
not
where I think
revenue number is what I'm saying.
I totally get what you mean, but I only bring that up because I often hear that, like, within the community. It's like, oh, I shouldn't be, have to be accountable for any kind of revenue numbers, and I agree with that in the direct standpoint. But ultimately, like, I have to be able to somehow, it may be like a 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon kind of thing, where like, but somehow or another, the things we're doing have to bring business to the company. Otherwise, there's no point in DevRel. Like, I mean, we're not aware. Like you said, awareness is a goal, but it doesn't. It's too fuzzy to really tie into a direct bit. Like, when push comes to shove and they're like, which team do we get rid of? It's like, oh, I don't even know what's this awareness doing us anyway.
If you would like to hear me talk more about this topic, I will put a link in the chat to the talk I gave at DevRelCon in Prague last year, which is basically also about the world is a little different than it was, and I say in my talk, I say, when I tell you these things, I might have had a different statement in 2021, even in the beginning of 2022. And it's, again, like you said, you maybe aren't tied to a revenue number, but like the company exists for a reason. And I guess the final thing I just want to say about that, you say we kind of like don't think about it in this way, but like part of the reason, I'll make one spicy comment that leads into another one, which is we as DevRels like to believe, first of all, we're an industry built on empathy. And we get really mad when we get stereotyped into all DevRels do is fly around the world and give talks and whatever. And you know who we love to stereotype the hell out of? Sales and marketing people. Right? Mm-hmm. And the thing about sales that I would say when it comes to this is the reason is because we have this perception that like sales is like the used car salesman, right? Sales and marketing also to a certain extent are there to trick you into doing a thing. And I'm like, if your product's so crappy that the only way someone would pay for it is if they were tricked, then maybe you shouldn't be there. So that's just the only general thing. There are definitely sketchy, toxic people in sales. Don't get me wrong. I'm not like, hey, everybody in sales, there's toxic and crappy people in everything we do. Mm-hmm. But Brian, you were trying to take us somewhere.
Oh no, so I was going to bring up Allie's video, which came up on.
It's the only reason Allie's watching right now is because she thinks we're going to talk about her. So we definitely have to.
So so just in case for those who didn't catch it, so Allie posted this video, "Why I Left Developer Relations," which actually hits on a number of things that we've already talked about. Number one, the why does a team, why does a company have DevRel? It also even talks about like toxic people in DevRel. So like all of these things came up in her video. It's really good. So like she lists. I'm going to put a link for those folks who haven't seen it yet into the chat. But she had 9 things. So most of which I felt like had a lot of truth in them. Like I think writing. You don't write so much code. I warn people when they're thinking about becoming DevRel. I'm like, you do realize this, you don't write as much code as you might think you do. Like, I know people imagine it's like, oh, I just get to come up with fun demos and code fun demos all day. And I'm like, I mean, I guesstimate my job is maybe 20% writing code, if that, it's like.
I recently got out of an interview, and I feel comfortable sharing this. This is public information. You can go find the job description on the internet. And I walked away after an informational call and was like, this is so not a fit, because the interview, they had reached out to me, had seen my resume and my for hire page, and had even sent me links to work that I had done. And I was like, yes, that's my work. Then they were like, do you feel comfortable passing a technical exam? And I was like, sure, I will do a take-home technical exam. And then they were like, on top of that, you'll have to do a live coding session with our founders that isn't related to the job you are doing. And I was like, okay. And then they're like, a red flag about you is you don't have a computer science degree. And I was like,
why are you still in this conversation at this point, Erin?
Yeah, I was like, and then they were like, also,
like, even if you had all those things, like this sounds terrible.
I was like, and then I like asked them, and they're like, okay, you know, it's that time. It's kind of awkward. Like, let's talk about salary. This is a senior level developer relations position, $115,000 in the New York City area. No guarantees of health insurance. No.
Yeah. So you're saying you didn't take it?
I did not. I did not continue the interview process on that one.
Yeah, but yeah. So I mean, to your point, I think you don't. I've had arguments about this because, like, you know, when you have coding tests and stuff like that, I don't mind doing homework. Honestly,
yeah, I don't mind it.
Give me homework, because homework to me is like, I got to know that I like your product. I want to be able to use the product and say, hey, you know what? This is a product I would actually be out there talking about. That I'm cool with homework.
I have people who got out of interviews because I started doing the homework and I was like, actually, I don't like this product. Yeah. And I've walked away. I mean, like, no harm, no foul. I just don't like the product and I can't vouch for it.
But yet, so back on Allie's video, she's okay. She doesn't write enough code. Companies don't know what they want. The influencer DevRel pipeline is another one she mentioned. I feel like that one. I feel it, but I also feel like it's getting a little bit better, partly because of that, you know, companies are realizing they need to get some value out of DevRel.
Oh, well, that's what I was going to say. Like, that happens when it's like, and Allie talked about it in the video too, which is like, why do you have it? Sometimes we have a DevRel because my board told me I had to have one, right? So then you're like, what do I look at? But when you're looking at like what you want to accomplish, and there's a whole pipeline into DevRel that I think is underrated, and it is the SA to DevRel pipeline is so good. And I'm not just saying that because that was me, but like,
sorry,
my dogs are sleeping.
Nope, that was mine.
And the solution architects or sales engineers or whatever are very good at understanding how to make things useful, you know, and go into that place. And again, it's not they're going to turn around and try to sell it. But a lot of it all still goes back to all of this is like, why are you there? And one thing I want to just bring up, and this is true, and I think Allie kind of talked about this in her video, the parts that I saw. Like I said in the chat, I started watching it right before this, and then my internet went out, and I got it back just in time. So I only saw the first half of the video, so I'm going to watch the rest of it because it was really good. Because there was also, and I'm not switching into this conversation, but there was on the other side of the today, there was like a tweet from Emily Freeman that had to do with doing DevRel at scale. And like, there is a ocean of difference in conversation between DevRel at a seed round 12-person startup and DevRel at AWS or Google or Microsoft. In some ways and in some ways not. But when you're looking at a certain time, and then in between, it gets even different. Like, and then those of us that sit in between those two, because there's things that are true at either end that are different in the middle. So it's always really important, I think, in any conversations, we have to be really careful about broad generalities, because number one, DevRel contains multitudes, and the lens upon which we're having this conversation is very context dependent upon the size of the organization. That said, there absolutely are things that are true across the board, right? About why do you do it? What are you there? Do you understand? And also the not all anytime we get into like the one true DevRel, right? There's a real DevRel would do this. A real DevRel can write code. A real DevRel is good at speaking. There are people who are made, because this is what is DevRel? Developer relations. It's about how do you relate and engage with your community of users. And community is a whole other thing we can talk about. That's become such a loaded word, and there's stuff I'm thinking about within my organization about when we talk about community, there's perceptions about, oh, you're talking about the open source community. And it's like, no, the community is our universe, right?
Mhm.
And there are people in our, and again, and so many words we can't use anymore because it becomes something else. Like I say, they're in our orbit, our lowercase orbit, right? They're touching us. They're part of it. And they may never be a customer. They may never even be a user of our product, but they are part of the community, right? So, yeah. Anyway, there's certain things that are always true, and there's certain things that are very different upon what you're trying to accomplish. But first of all, anybody who's like, well, if you're a really real DevRel, you would not care about this, or you would do this, or you would do whatever, is like for the birds, and I hate them, and they should go away.
Well, and I think to touch on like that point that you said there, and like what Laura and Cassidy are putting in there, I think there's also the spectrum of DevRel, dev advocacy. Developer experience is another one we see a lot. Or my first job in the space was head of open source community, which was basically being a PM on top of everything else. I think to Cassidy's point, perfect timing is an education problem. Like, what is the role? And like, personally, I have the take of whatever the tool or the product that you're using, actually know how the product works. Like, that is my biggest pet peeve, is like when people who are doing tutorials or content or whatever, it doesn't actually know or understand the product. It's a huge red flag for me. So if I see content created by a company and they don't use the product themselves, red flag. But also like the level of technicality can change with company. Like, my formal background is in journalism. That's fine. But it's funny because they see that on my resume and they go, oh, she's completely non-technical at all. And I'm like, my last job, I was in Python and using Docker every day. And no, like, no. And it's a very different thing. But at the end of the day, it's like, what objectives are you trying to accomplish?
Yeah.
And I think this goes back, like Cassidy said, it's like so many companies want different things. And that's why I think it's really important. You can't, unfortunately, there's one general title that can mean 30 different jobs, and they're all valid implementations of that job, but it might not be the implementation that A, you want to do, and or B, you're good at. And so that's why it's important to ask a lot of these questions. And it was, like Laura says in the chat, people forget you're interviewing the company as well. And that's a big part of that, is to say like, okay, what is this job? And it's funny because, again, you would do this for any other kind of a job. You would be like, so what will I do here? And if they were like, you will do business things, you'd be like, no, maybe you could kind of tell me what I actually do and like what I'm accountable for and where I work. And it's like, no, you're going to do business. Yeah. That would be crazy. But we do this here. It'd be like, well, you're just in charge of our community. What does that mean? Because what I think it means is not necessarily what you think it means. And as long as those Venn diagrams of what I think it means and you think it means overlap a bunch, but if they are very small, then it's probably a bad place to be. So
I've really loved the adoption of the term user ecosystem. And I think that's one that I've really started to love.
I like
and we use that at my last role. Lauren Sell was the person who like used it a lot. And it's like, how do we think of our user ecosystem? So like the larger, where are our users, and then what tools are they using or thinking about? And then how does this look across, customer success, community, open source, developers? Like, what are like, and thinking about it from that perspective. And that's been like my obsession lately. Foreshadowing things coming on my blog.
I want to challenge the word user there, because that ecosystem is not exclusive or includes only inclusive of people that use your product or use your tool. And it's like, when I think about like kind of concentric circles and like, again, things I'm thinking about writing, and I'm deciding at what level of this is me writing for my team and writing for the internet and where these things go, and versus most of it just ends up in texts to other people as I think out loud. But it's like, there are people that are part of that ecosystem or universe or whatever that are very valuable part of that will never, ever touch anything related to your thing, but they're part of that. And I'm not going to want to say like, it's easy to say, I'm going to shortcut with the words because they're faster and I hate them and it's fine. They're the thought leaders, the influencers, or whatever, the people in that space who are part of that, right? Like, you know, if you're in the Kubernetes space, if you're a product related to Kubernetes, Kelsey Hightower is in your ecosystem, and he is never going to touch your thing, maybe, but that's fine. And it's not that he's in your ecosystem because you want him to endorse you, but the work he does influences, and I mean that in the right way of influence, not like influencer way, but it affects that whole way we live. Like the way that I do DevOps work when I did work for a living was influenced in a good way, like the right way of the word, by the work done by people in that space, by Andrew Clay Schaefer, by Nicole Forsgren or whatever. So they're part of, so when I was like at PagerDuty, for example, I would sit there and say that, and I'm not saying these things to name drop because I'm going to tell you why it matters. We would say that John Allspaw, who was, you know, a learning from incidents, you know, expert, created blameless postmortems, all of this stuff is in the PagerDuty ecosystem and never would use PagerDuty. And that's totally cool, but he's part of it. And it's not because we have to curry favor from them or whatever. They're just part of the way we reason about things.
Yeah,
exactly.
So I you know, in listening to you all talk about this, one thing that has struck me is that there has been so a lot of the growth, I think, at DevRel over the recent years has been these people, like the single one-person DevRel team at a small startup kind of thing. And that's, I think, like going back to Ali's video, I felt like a lot of that stuff like aligned with experiences at small startups where they hadn't kind of, where we talked about where they were told they needed a DevRel, but what didn't have clear idea of what they wanted out of a DevRel, or they just had this vague idea that hiring DevRel would suddenly like, oh, I'm going to suddenly, you know, we're going to build our automatically, like bring in somebody who's an influencer. We're going to suddenly get all these followers and get all these users and blah, blah, blah. And it was just like none of that. Number one, none of that ever really pans out the way they think it will. And number two, ultimately it becomes like, well, that's not, they start to realize that's not stuff that affects the business. Like it's just, you know, I can have tons of followers on Twitter, which I don't anymore, but like, you know, but it's not necessarily going to drive money or real, you know, like it can build some awareness, but it's not ultimately like that important of a business goal.
So I love where you're going with this, but I have a real life story which actually exactly counters that. So,
okay.
Which is really interesting. And it's like, it's also one of the gray areas of my, like, in something that I've personally struggled a lot with being in DevRel. And it's actually something Ali mentions in the video of like DevRel and dev advocacy, your life kind of blurs a lot of the time, meaning like sometimes you don't have a 9 to 5. I'm like, and especially like, even when I was working, I was like, oh, it's just on my Slack. I'm just going to respond to 3 things real quick, blah, blah, blah. It's 3 sentences. So outside of tech, I do run a comedy show. We have an AI comedy show that I run. I'm a co-producer in, if you're in the New York area tonight at 8 p.m. at Crystal Lake. But one of the things there, soft shell there. But I actually used the tool that I was formerly employed by in the development of this comedy show. And I've actually done a technical, now I've submitted things that I've built for the comedy show as a technical exam in the interview process as well. I had someone who had attended our event as the comedy show. They not only attended the event, but they later was like, that was really cool. How'd you build it? And I'm talking through them how I built it and blah, blah, blah. And they showed up to the workshop next week I was hosting at my day job. And they would have never found out because they were just like random person in the comedy scene. And so it's like, but again, it was loosely related. Is that everybody? No, most people didn't. But like, I still tracked 3 people who came that they first heard about us through this comedy show. Very small.
Yeah. And to be clear, I'm not saying those things are useless. Yeah. I'm just saying like ultimately, like, you know, when that's the primary goal, when, you know, I think, you know, the important DevRel activities are much more easily tied, like the content activities Maddie was talking about earlier. Like I can much more easily tie that to a clear business benefit. You know, I like where does this content sit on the funnel in terms of like, you know, how it helps us, you know, either bring people into the top of the funnel or help move people along in the funnel kind of thing, like, you know, so that they, Is it sit somewhere like that help somebody in the purchasing process make that decision kind of thing. I may not be able to tie it to actual revenue, but I can tell you where it fits into that process.
I mean, there's a lot of stuff in marketing that you don't tie to direct revenue. I mean, like there's lots of things that are valuable in an organization that are very, and like you're making a lot of leaps to get it to the revenue.
Mhm.
I mean, product is a thing, and that's the other thing too. Is like you sit there and say, think about the idea of a developer advocate or a DevRel person of the right type. Like again, because it's not everybody is the same shape. Who is customer zero, right? Who is providing, and this is one of the things. Like the reason we don't say evangelist anymore is twofold. One is because it's colonist and not great. The other is because evangelist implies a one-way conversation. And I always like to say, and this is why I'm telling you that I'm an ops person and info persons, I say that developer advocacy is full duplex, right? It goes both ways. Now, this also gets us into like the whole work as imagined versus work as done thing. And we need to have reality about where we sit in that spectrum. That said, so if you are in a DevRel group that is connected more closely into the product thing, and then you have that tight feedback loop into product and giving fast feedback back into there, that's all, very easy to connect to business value the same way that the rest of your product organization is, but it's got to be part of where that's happening. So like all these business goals exist and everybody else in your company deals with them, right? And it's like I used to say in my DevOps talks, I'd say, do you know how your company makes money? If you don't, go find out. I'll wait, because we can't have any other conversation if you don't know what your company is, how you're connecting to value. Like nobody employs you to just have fun. And the reality and the problem is, and here I'll get spicy now, is there's a whole bunch of us, maybe myself included, for a certain amount of time when money was cheap over the last few years, when you literally could be employed as a DevRel and your job was to have fun. It doesn't mean you didn't work hard, but we were able to do that. And that's not the case. And that's not because, partially, yes, late stage. Actually, it is because of late stage capitalism. That's totally fine. But that's what's happening. Like we can rail about it all we want, but if you want to have a job, we need to figure out where this goes. So for at least for a while, we have to go back and work for a living for a bit. You can't have a job where your entire existence is that you get to like do things that are so far away, that are so long tail, and it's just totally fun. Those days will maybe come back, or maybe they'll come back to a different thing, but nobody hold your breath, because in the meantime, I'm telling you, the bank ain't going to accept a mortgage payment that is, I'm just waiting until money is cheap again. In the meantime, I'm going to do these things. And again, I've referred to myself as the cynical DevRel, because it's like, it sucks. Like, again, none of this is me saying it's right, but it's the world, and also, and this is the other thing too. I think you alluded to this a little bit, Erin, when you're talking about your scenario, and, it's tough out there. That was sort of like kind of my talk at DevRelCon, was saying, hey, it's tough out there. And what I'm seeing is that the jobs are there, but the bags are small. Right. And that's the, and you mentioned that, and it's funny because I am not looking for a job. I'm safe to know my boss is not listening to this, because I just saw that he's on the Silicon Angle and the Cube live stream at Google Cloud Next right now. So he's on a different stream. So I'm okay. But I'm not. But I know people who are. So I actually take a fair number of calls from recruiters, because I'm doing a little filtering for my friends to say, hey, is it worth your time to call this person back? Because especially when I know I'm not looking, I'm happy to ask for what the number is. I'm like, where are you looking at? And I had someone I talked to who was like, literally, they were basically hiring. They wanted a CMO when all was said and done. It was like going to be a VP of marketing or whatever, and something like that. $100,000. But then it's like, oh, but you get all this equity, and you're like, cool. Guess what? I can't pay with equity. My mortgage, child support, dog food you don't spend with that. So it's rough, but that sucks.
But I think, unfortunately, we're doing this. I've done the job search in August of last year, now the job search in August of this year. And I actually think this year is a little bit easier. And maybe I'm just saying that prematurely. I'm currently not employed, but I feel like maybe this year's easier, but I don't know. Who knows? And I don't know if that's the experience you've kind of encountered, Maddie, or.
Yeah, and it's like, yeah, Laura says, I
Yeah.
see that, and it's really frustrating from a perspective. Again, I should definitely say this is primarily, even though my context on one side when I'm looking to help my friends find jobs and help them do that, they're almost always stateside where that comes in. Whereas me, I have a global team. So when Maddie is hiring, and Maddie isn't hiring right now, but Maddie might be at some point. That's not a promise. That's just saying you never know. Where things are going, and I hope that we are very fair and stuff. The one thing that does suck, and I'm not making an excuse to Laura's point about, like, they'll say it's a remote job, but it's US only, is it's a lot of just dumb bullshit about, like, where you have a presence in the company, and it's like, oh yeah, the remote anywhere but Colorado. Yeah, I think people have stopped doing that, because that should be a big red flag to you, because that means we don't actually want to try to pay you as little as possible. But I think that's I don't remember. It's all everything's terrible.
Yeah,
but maybe it'll get slightly less terrible eventually.
Yeah, I think it definitely will. I mean, I've been in DevRel for I've been trying to remember exactly, like 13 years. So it's been a while, and I've been through some ups and downs in DevRel. So, like, I've seen, stuff like this before, where DevRel teams, had what we thought at the time was large DevRel teams, but then got dwarfed much later. But, like, getting cut back, including when I was on the DevRel team at Adobe, that kind of, like, they're like, oh yeah, we're not doing developer things anymore. DevRel team was mostly gone. But so I've seen this stuff happen before. I think, the right now feels a little weird at times, just because so much of the growth to me of DevRel was in startups that now have had to kind of really, because of the lack of VC money, have had to really cut back on their spending on this kind of thing, and be a little more cautious about spending in DevRel. So I think that's affecting the salaries in DevRel specifically. Is there's
money isn't cheap like it was.
Yeah, exactly.
That's the it's terrible. But one of the things I was thinking about, and I was talking to a friend of mine who is, like, not pleased with their job, and that doesn't narrow it down, because lots of us are not pleased with it. Lots of people are not pleased with their job. I'm very pleased with my job. Boss who's not watching because he's on the cube right now. Yeah, thanks, Will. I kind of assumed the gross was for me, because it's Will who's in the chat who's like, that's gross. That's where that goes. But they're like, hey, I'm in, and the one advice I would give, and maybe it's right, and if things are real bad where you're at, get out if you have to, but try to stay as much as you can, because what happens is, because those salaries are lower, and as someone who was in a situation that did a reset, and how long it took me to get back. So I got laid off. This was not in DevRel, but it still applies. I got laid off as an ops person 20 years ago. I think it was about 20-ish, about 20 years ago or so. And I, in the process of looking for a job, it was a very tough time. This was, circa 2002, which, some of us will be triggered by that and say, like, and I ended up having to take any job I could get. And it was a good 40% pay cut. And it took me 4 years to get back to where I had been, because once you're in there, you're fighting this fight up there. So if you can hold on to what you have, but if things are awful, would we care to speculate about when the market will bounce back? Well, if I knew that,
yeah,
I wouldn't have been working. No, but I mean, I think it's going to get better before it gets worse, because we're starting to see, I don't want to see the purse strings loosen up a little bit. But I think there's a recentering, a recalibrating that is happening. And I think there was a bit of a glut, right? Like, it was sort of like, cool. And we saw this on both sides, right? We saw this in situations like Allie talked about, and Allie had, which was I just got to get somebody or whatever. And then it's like, oh shit, you've been here for a while, or someone's been here for a while. And now I'm like, I don't understand what you do, so I'm going to reframe you. But then, or on the other side, we saw this at some of the really big places where they're like, money is cheap. We're going to throw around millions of dollars to hire up like 35 people to like do this thing. And then but it all comes back when eventually the balance sheet balances, right? And so this is also why I think there's value in like figuring out how we get more cross-functional, when we get more like because like the more general you can be in some ways, and I'm not saying T-shaped, right? Like I know people get that becomes a thing, but like if I have some sidecar stuff, because it's also what sets you apart. Because the other thing is when you can do more than one thing, you can hold on when the one thing you mostly do isn't as much in demand. You can find a thing that you're also really good at. So yeah, but I think again, I would say too, for me, you know, the people that are reaching out to me, it's a lot of like seed round AI startups that want that DevRel team of one who's also, like Ali said, is also your technical content marketer and is also your demand gen and is also all of these things. And I mean, here's the reality, right? At a certain point, like you got to take what you can get, you know, I mean, it's, you know, a certain point, like you can't pay your rent with pride, you know, but also go into it like knowing wherever that is. And I think the other thing in general, and this is, you know, and I'd love to hear, we're getting a lot of really great, there's a lot of super smart people in the chat who have a lot to say that we should listen to. You will find, and this was something I've seen people having success, and this is harder to do for new folks, because Cassidy just said this is rough for new folks. And part of the reason is this: there are companies that have short-term cash, but not long-term cash. So like, especially when you look at a company that's dealing with their runway and everything like that, taking on a hire is a long-ish term OpEx cost. Paying you as a contractor, as a consultant, $30,000 to do one thing, that money is there. But there, it's funny because it's like, hey, Aaron, we could hire you, like we could contract you, basically say, we're going to give you this check to do this one thing, and you're like, holy cow, but wouldn't it be cheaper for you to pay me less and be an employee? They're like, you would think that, wouldn't you? Right? But especially when you're looking at what your board is looking at, because you're looking at your runway, and when we bring you on for $150,000 or whatever, we have to plan to be able to keep paying that. But actually, you know, but short term, I can sit there and I can write you a check because that's CapEx, right? That's the thing. But that's very hard to do when you're new, because you can't sell yourself as like, I'm good at this. So like that's hard, you know. So there's not a perfect solution. But I'm seeing a lot of places that when I've seen people talk to them, and they're just like, dude, we can't hire you, or you know, man, we can't hire you, but you want to consult?
Yeah.
You know, because that money I have, you know.
Yeah, I agree with some of the comments in the chat that it's the bounce back has kind of started, I feel like. I mean, I'll put it this way. I think the best place to find jobs in DevRel, right, like has always been, like for the past few years, has been the DevRel Collective's Slack and their jobs board, right? And that jobs board went through a period, I think, like starting sometime late last year for like 6 months, where I swear there was almost nothing. It was almost silent. The only posts you'd get were people looking for jobs or losing their jobs, and very few jobs. And it's felt like it's picked up. I do think, to somebody's point, I can't remember who in the comments here, it's a lot of seed stage, because, and to me this makes sense, because seed stage is like, hey, I've got X dollars, right? Like I need to like move really, really quickly. I need to like build, you know, I have this much runway, and the other companies are all like, once they're past that seed stage, they're all like, well, now we need to prove for our next round that we're being more efficient with our dollars, is the thing that all the VCs are looking for now. So it's like, you know, and DevRel doesn't really fit into expanding, you know, that our efficiencies, you know, or can, but I mean, my point is like that I'm just saying from their perspective. So I think it makes sense. It's a lot of seed round folks, and the bigger companies to me are all like, I think they saw an opportunity to kind of trim a lot of people and said, hey, you know, we're going to cut it, not because there was no value in their DevRel, but because I've worked for big companies. They always like, we're like, okay, downturn, we can just make some slices, even though we're making record profits.
Can I make a little bit of a hot take here?
Absolutely, that's
and
what
this
we're all
may
about.
get away from me, and I apologize.
Spicy pickles.
And this won't. What did you say? Mention pickles?
I said spicy pickles.
Oh,
Spicy relish.
You
Spicy
really
relish.
want to make your joke. Erin has a really, really good joke about pickles she's dying to make.
All right. But, okay, let's. I want to hear the spicy
take. Okay.
relish.
So one of the things we're always like, oh my God, I hate that they hired a DevRel when they really want a technical content marketer. Hey, you know what? Maybe go be a technical content marketer for a minute. For two reasons. One is like, because it'll actually help you do your other job better to learn how to do that, and or you might actually be good at it. And again, it gives us that sidecar thing. So if at a certain point where you're like, hey man, I really, really want, like, the thing I want most in the world is to, like, you know, be a race car driver that drives golf carts, and they're like, well, that's not a thing that happens right now, but what you could do is, like, get a lot of good practice driving golf carts, like, you know, in some other way. Like, maybe you could do that, and it's adjacent. So I think that's sort of the thing too. And it doesn't have to be I'm naming that one. There's lots of other DevRel adjacent like roles and things to do that make us better at what we do as a DevRel for whatever kind of DevRel you are. Now, if you're not the kind of DevRel that writes, then probably don't try to go get a job as a TCM, because it's probably not, first of all, you're not going to be able to get the job most likely, and it's not going to help you. But maybe there's some other engineering role, maybe there's some other product role, maybe there's some other thing you can do. And I know I'm not, by the way, none of this is like, oh, it's so easy, just go do that. I'm just sort of saying, like, can we reason about, like, ways to do things that are adjacent, you know?
Yeah. That kind of reminds me of a period when, okay, there was a point in my career I moved all the way up to director, but it was like director of content. It was in marketing. Anyway, I didn't end up loving that job for multiple reasons, but I decided I want to get back into like a IC DevRel, and it turned out to be really, really difficult to do, because everybody's like, oh, I'd only been in that job a year, and I was doing a lot of the writing and stuff, and they're like, oh, you're a director in marketing, and I don't know what can you bring to the table, kind of. Yeah. So I literally spent like the next 6 months or so as I was working, I wrote a new blog post every single week on different topics. Like, I made sure every week I had something, and it was not like I don't think you have to stick to that schedule, but the point was I was trying to build my resume back into the role I wanted to fit into, by doing things that was outside my job. I like it. This was nothing related to work, but it helped me be able to say, well, actually, I do I can do DevRel. I have done DevRel. Look at all these blog posts I've written in the past 6 months, etc. So I think in a similar sense, if you're trying to get into it, you can. I think there's ways to build that skill set, or at least beef up your resume, even if you don't necessarily have the role yet.
Well, I think that's like the advice that a lot of people like have been giving, is like, you know, do the job. You have to, in order to get the job you want, you have to do the job before you're ready to do. And I think it's, you know, so much like, you know, I'm an adjunct at NYU on the side, and so much of my job is like, charge for your work. Like, these are graduate students, like, they're not 19, they're many times have 10 years of work under their belt. And they're like, on one hand, I'm like, charge for your work, but on the other hand, I'm like, but you need to be out there and be present. And sometimes
it's a hard balance.
It's a hard balance, but it's also like, and I'm a big believer of, like, you know, always give more than you can, like, give more than you take, you know, put it out in the world and it'll come back to you. But yeah, it's an adventure, man.
Yeah. I mean, and I know I recognize that, like, it's a hard thing to do. Like, it's not always, I don't want people like say, I give up all their time, their weekends or whatever. But I kind of determined I had to do it to, like, get back the role I wanted. But anyway, we are running low on time here. We got like 6 minutes left, and we have so Maddie, we didn't tell you about this in the pre-show, but this is the key moment in our show where
no pressure or anything.
No, don't worry, this is all on Erin, because I never had.
Good. Okay.
So there's two things. First of all, obviously the show, because it's DevRelish, it's themed around pickles. Um, and you may not know this about Erin, but Erin is an amateur pickler. I don't know.
Fermentator?
I think it's just pickler, right? Pickler?
Pickler, yeah.
Pickler.
Yeah.
Pickler.
I'd like to know. So she's an amateur pickler because she'd like to be able to compete in the pickle Olympics. That's why she's not going pro.
Yeah, oh, I do like this. I like where we're going with this. Actually, through this whole DevRel job career path, I'm going to be a pickle comedian and a professional pickle comedian. And then
but if you're a professional pickle comedian, you can't compete in the Olympics.
Exactly.
So I want you to think this one out. You might be being short-sighted.
Right. I like these job titles coming in.
Brian Smith. Yeah.
Brian Smith's a good one. Ooh, that's a good one.
Yeah, let's see. Fermentationist. Yeah, okay. And Brian Smith. Okay. Yeah, you know, on that note, before you give us your pickle fact, Erin, like you really do have like a wide. I mean, you're a pickler, a comedian. You were a journalist, and you code and do DevRel. So like, you know, I think that covers all the bases if the bases were pickles and comedy and DevRel.
Yeah.
But, yeah.
Things I'm not good at. Keeping my desk clean. There's a nice pile of books right here that are cleanly off camera. So don't bring me for that.
But I would lead with the pickles on your job search for sure.
For sure. And I will agree with Maddie. The best pickles are sold out of a barrel because the fermentation process is very fascinating. But
also, my friend who works at the Ren Fair learned this year, as many years as he worked at the Ren Fair, that if you go to the pickle barrel people with your flagon full of ice, they will fill it with iced pickle juice for you. And he was like sitting in his shop drinking pickle juice. Was like, how has it taken me how many 10 plus years of working here to not understand this was a thing you could do?
Oh my goodness. I love that. To use the line, that does pickle my fancy.
Now it's done. Okay. So pickle fact. Let's go.
Pickle fact away. So I actually went to an academic journal for today's pickle fact. And in case you were wondering, the bacteria in pickle, this is probably not one if you're like a germaphobe, I guess, but it's actually one of the highest strains. Like you can find the most diversity in bacteria in lacto-fermented pickles. So there's over 49 different strains of bacteria found to make a successful best tasting pickles, according to this journal article. And it is actually some of the best bacteria for your like metabolism and your microbiome.
Yep. I had the same thought, by the way, as Cassidy, more or less. I was like, wow, there's academic journals about pickling.
I learned to pickle I learned to pickle as part of a class I took in grad school. It's a whole nother tangent, but there is the guide that I use to pickle is actually from Washington State's Department of Agriculture, and it is an open source book and guide to how much brine and salt and your acidity that you need to kill the bacteria, to make good bacteria.
Yep. I think Maddie Two Shoots can close us out. The CPO, okay? I think, yeah.
Yeah. It's okay. And I'm sorry, Laura, I probably grossed you out with all the bacteria, but you know what? I will eat all your pickles for you, or fermented Bloody Marys mix, because that's my other jam. Fermented Bloody Mary.
I do love how the end of this show always just kind of goes way deep into pickle related, like play on words and stuff like that. So yeah, the comments and in the show, it's my favorite part. Well, not really my favorite part.
Yeah, aside from this is like the best Google search I do all week is this. But Cassidy, I got you on the blessed Bloody Mary. I make a fermented Bloody Mary if you like a good spicy brine. Takes a week. It's very good.
So with that, we are out of time. Maddie, this was a really, really awesome conversation. I had so much fun. And thank you to everybody in the audience. It's been like great seeing all these comments. I mean,
great audience here. Like,
absolutely.
If you want to be on, like, shoot us a DM of like all of that stuff because I would like so many of you are brilliant. Cassidy was on the show.
Yeah, we'd love to have you all as guests. If you haven't been a guest, you want to talk about DevRel, but we will be back next month. I will be posting that soon. And also please check out cfe.dev we've got a bunch of stuff in September coming up. Tons of freebie events.
Can I promote one thing? I just realized I should have said this when people were paying attention. That podcast I talked about that I do, Arrested DevOps, we just released an episode that is about building your personal brand with Cassandra Ferris that is maybe interesting to lots of people watching this. So go to arresteddevops.com, find it in your podcatcher, listen to it, do all this stuff.
Yeah, I did post the link earlier, but
I don't know why I didn't put the connection that earlier that I was like, actually maybe interesting. That's not about Kubernetes. We barely ever talk about Kubernetes. All we talk about is platform engineering now. But anyway,
awesome. All right. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next time. Bye.